As autumn gets underway in the Northern Hemisphere, NVIDIA has just launched its latest GeForce 40 series graphics cards, perfectly timed for the long gaming nights ahead. The first 40 series card out the gates is the RTX 4090, with two versions of the RTX 4080 to follow a little later in November. In this video, we're going to be taking a look under the hood of the RTX 4090. We'll go through its specs and benchmark it in multiple games so you can see just how powerful it really is when upgrading your PC or buying a next-gen 3XS system with one installed. And if you want us to make even more videos like this about new hardware, then make sure to hit the like button below. Now, being a whole new series, the RTX 4090 and its siblings use a new architecture, which, continuing with NVIDIA tradition, is named after the pioneering 19th century mathematician and computer scientist Ada Lovelace. The new Ada Lovelace architecture, or Ada for short, builds on the foundations laid by the two previous GeForce architectures, Ampere and Turing, with a renewed focus on increasing ray tracing performance. This takes the form of a number of architectural improvements and new features such as the DLSS 3, which we'll cover in depth later in this video. And good old-fashioned brute performance thanks to having more of everything. This ranges from more CUDA cores to more tensor cores, more RT cores, more cache memory, and finally more transistors. 76.3 billion of them to be precise, a lot more than the 28.3 billion of the previous champ, the RTX 3090 Ti. Despite all of this, however, the RTX 4090 has the same 450 watt power rating and 850 watt recommended PSU of the RTX 3090 Ti, thanks to being made of incredibly tiny transistors. Whereas the RTX 3090 Ti was made using a Samsung 8nm process, the RTX 4090 is made using a TSMC 4nm process, so the new chip packs all of this into a smaller size die than its forebear. Before we take a look at the specs of the RTX 4090, let's take a look at what's new in the Ada architecture. And a good place to start are the new RT cores and tensor cores. Not only have the more of them, but surprise, surprise, they've also been redesigned. For instance, not only are the 3rd gen RT cores twice as fast at ray triangle intersections, but they also add support for two new functions. The first of these, the Opacity Micromap engine, accelerates alpha traversal by creating a virtual mesh of micro triangles, each with an opacity state that the RT cores uses to determine if a ray hits or misses. You can see this process in action in these two images. In the left image, an opacity mask is applied to a maple leaf made up of two triangles, resulting in the right image, which the Opacity Micromap engine then uses to determine which micro triangles are opaque, shown in green, unknown, shown in red or blue, or not part of the leaf, shown in white. This process allows the RT cores to characterize many rays themselves, only having to pass back unknown micro triangles to a shader to be resolved. The second new feature of 3rd gen RT cores is the Displaced micro mesh engine. This generates meshes of micro triangles, allowing Ada GPUs to build and store BVH data twice as fast as 2nd gen RT cores in Ampere GPUs. And this is hugely beneficial for ray tracing, as building these BVH geometry data structures is computationally and memory intensive. The Displaced micro mesh engine works by exploiting spatial coherence in 3D models, enabling them to be compressed or put crudely, creating LODs within LODs. LOD being a commonly used technique of adjusting the visible level of detail in a 3D model as you get closer to it. In this example, the 3D model of a crab is broken down into base triangles shown on the 2nd vertical slice, with higher geometric detail shown in micro meshes on the 3rd vertical slice. The final result is rendered on the right, with no visible change in detail across the areas of the crab, meaning that ray trace games will be able to maintain high levels of geometric detail without stalling the frame rates. Working alongside these two new engines to boost ray tracing performance is another new feature, shader execution reordering, a bit like how CPUs can process some instructions out of order to increase throughput. SER reorders rays from being processed in divergent order to an ordered structure, enabling rays that hit the same surface to be calculated together more efficiently. This new technique increases performance by up to 2 times in highly divergent scenes using path tracing, the most obvious example today being Cyberpunk 2077, which NVIDIA claims runs at up to 44% with SER enabled. This series of diagrams illustrates SER in action in a simple scene. In the first image, you can see the rays hitting the 4 objects in the scene, resulting in a series of highly ordered primary shading instructions. However, once the secondary rays start to get path traced in the third image, this results in a highly divergent set of calculations, as seen in the fourth image. And this is where SER steps in, reordering each ray into object order again, so that they can be processed more efficiently, as shown in the fifth image. Moving on from ray tracing, the Ada architecture has another trick up its sleeve, DLSS 3, and a new bit of hardware known as the Optical Flow Accelerator. The latter isn't wholly new. There was an OFA in Ampere GPUs, but it wasn't really used, and the new OFA in Ada is twice as fast to boot. This has been developed to breathe new life into DLSS in its third guise. DLSS got off to a shaky start with sometimes questionable image quality. DLSS 2 works very well indeed, using deep learning models and the tensor in Ampere GPUs to upscale individual frames to the native resolution of your screen. The end result being much higher performance than would be possible using native resolution, enabling you to turn on advanced features such as ray tracing whilst maintaining a smooth frame rate. DLSS 3 builds on this success, giving Ada GPUs the ability to create whole new frames for even smoother frame rates. Now, whilst this might sound like space magic at first, we'll try and make sense of it for you. When DLSS 3 gets to work, it starts off using the same basic process as DLSS 2, upscaling the first frame from one resolution to another, let's say from 1080p to 4K. Once this super resolution frame has been rendered, the GPU gets to work on the next frame, and so on. However, in between each of these odd-numbered frames, DLSS 3 gets to work rendering and generating whole new frames, which are inserted into the sequence of frame using even numbers. NVIDIA uses reflex to reduce the latency added by generating these even-numbered frames. These evenly numbered frames don't spring out of thin air, but are generated by the aforementioned Optical Flow Accelerator using a technique known as optical flow estimation. This is commonly used in computer vision applications to determine the direction and speed of objects in motion between frames. In the case of Ada GPUs, this data is combined with motion vectors from the game engine to create accurate frames which are rendered out by the tensor cores, a process known as DLSS frame generation. The end result is a sequence of upscaled odd-numbered frames interposed with evenly numbered frames from the Optical Flow Accelerator. To be clear, DLSS 3 isn't interlacing the odd-numbered frames, are actually calculated based on the content of the frame before and after them. If you think of it this way, DLSS 3 constructs, as opposed to natively renders, 7/8 of the pixels every pair of consecutive frames. In the example below, the GPU only natively renders 2 1080p frames, the parts of frames 1 and 3 in dark green, whilst DLSS 3 upscales these to 4K in light green. Finally, DLSS 3 generates 2 wholly new 4K frames, numbers 2 and 4. As you might expect, injecting entirely new frames isn't entirely without cost, and whilst DLSS 3 does massively increase the frame rate, especially in CPU-limited games such as flight simulators and complex RTs, it does also increase latency, although this is largely minimised when reflex is used. Even so, this means that DLSS 3 may not be the best option for fast-paced competitive shooters, something we hope to revisit in the future as the technology and games mature. In the meantime, DLSS 2 is better used in these types of games. So now that we've covered the principal new features and technologies introduced by the Ada architecture, let's take a closer look at the first 40 series cards, the RTX 4090, codenamed AD102. Although it's not a fair comparison as the architectures are different, it's armed with a massive 52% more CUDA, Tensor and RT cores than the RTX 3090 Ti, and operates at much higher clock speeds of between 2.23 and 2.52 GHz. The only thing that hasn't really seen any uplift is the memory, which remains as 24 GB of GDDR6X, providing just over a terabyte per second of bandwidth. To be fair to NVIDIA, the only way to significantly improve on this would have been to switch to HBM2 memory, but this is way more expensive than GDDR6X, and it only really makes sense to use on data center GPUs such as the monstrous A100 and H100, which Scan's AI division provides in its deep learning training systems. We've also included in the table the specs of the 4090's little siblings, the yet-to-be-released 4080 16GB and the 4080 12GB. There's more to these two graphics cards than just the memory quantity, however. The GPUs are also different too, with very different numbers of CUDA, Tensor and RT cores. And finally, it's worth noting that the RTX 4090 isn't the full implementation of the AD102 die. That would up the CUDA cores from 16,384 to 18,432 CUDA cores, the Tensor cores from 512 to 576, and the RT cores from 128 to 144. As such, we're sure to see a fully fledged AD102 graphics card unleashed at some point with these specs in the next year or two. Like the 3090 Ti, the 4090 has the same nominal 450 watt TDP. This means that you're going to need to have at least an 850 watt PSU to run it properly. There are two possible ways to power a 4090 depending on the specific card that you choose and your PSU. The first option requires at least 3 8-pin PCIe cables from your PSU, which you'll then connect to an adapter that combines the power from these cables into a simple 16-pin PCIe 5 connector that plugs into the graphics card. Adding a fourth 8-pin PCIe cable may allow you to overclock your 4090 further. Alternatively, some PSU manufacturers such as Corsair have already announced PCIe 5 cables that work with their existing PSUs, as long as they have a Type 4 PCIe connector. You can check if your Corsair PSU has these using this QR code. The second option is to buy a PCIe Gen 5 PSU. These have native 16-pin PCIe 5 cables that can power a 4090 without the need for messy adapters. Just make sure that the PSU you choose can provide at least 450 watts of power over the PCIe 5 connector. In case you're wondering, these new 16-pin PCIe 5 connectors are a bit confusing, because at first glance they look like they only have 12 pins. However, if you look closely, there are two arrays of pins, 12 main pins that provide power plus a separate array of 4 smaller pins that enable the PSU to communicate with the GPU. Finally, 4090 cards take up at least 3 slots, so make sure that you have sufficient space and airflow around where you're planning to install your 4090. These new graphics cards are monsters, especially the factory pre-overclocked premium models, which are extremely large. So check out the specs carefully on our website before buying. So now for the testing. We put the RTX 4090 through its paces up against its predecessors from the RTX 30 series, plus the nearest equivalent AMD Radeon RX 6000 series GPUs. All of these are high-end graphics cards, and all of the benchmarks will run at the highest quality settings, with all the eye candy dialed up to the max at 2 resolutions, 2560 by 1440 and 3840 by 2160. All of the cards were tested with the latest NVIDIA and AMD drivers, using a fresh install of Windows 11 Home in one of our 3XS gaming PCs, with the following specs that you can see on screen now. The action RPG Cyberpunk 2077 is a challenging game to run with ray tracing enabled at 1440p, with only the 4090 able to achieve a smooth rate without resorting to DLSS 2. That said, you get an even better frame rate if you turn it on, an astonishing 135 FPS. Put another way, the new 4090 is 65% faster than the previous champ, the 3090 Ti, leaving all the other cards to eat its digital dust. No graphics card is fast enough to play Cyberpunk 2077 at 4K with ray tracing enabled, but enabling DLSS 2 gives the 4090 a silky smooth 119 FPS frame rate. No other GPU can come close, with all others lagging well behind with double-digit frame rates. The open-world shooter Far Cry 6 does support gorgeous ray-traced graphics, but not DLSS. All the high-end GPUs we tested were able to run the game smoothly at 1440p. The 4090 really is overkill here, with a narrow 17% lead over the 3090 Ti. However, when we upped the resolution to 4K, the gaps between the older 30 series GPUs and the new 4090 started to widen. With ray tracing enabled, the 4090 purred along at 115 FPS, 44% faster than the 3090 Ti. Metro Exodus was one of the first games to implement ray tracing and support DLSS, and even at the highest quality settings remains a tough game to run smoothly. At 1440p, the new 4090 turned in a silky smooth frame rate of 122 FPS with ray tracing, speeding up to 132 FPS with DLSS enabled. These results are 54% and 48% faster than the 3090 Ti, very welcome speed up gen on gen. Metro Exodus at 4K is too much for most graphics cards to handle without resorting to DLSS 2. The 4090 is sufficiently powerful to render the game at a smooth 76 FPS. Even so, given the barely noticeable difference in image quality, we would recommend turning on DLSS, which ups the frame rate to 110 FPS. Compared to the older 3090 Ti, the new 4090 is 59% faster. 4 years after its release, Shadow of the Tomb Raider is still challenging for many graphics cards at the highest quality settings. At 1440p, all the cards tested exceeded 60 FPS average frame rate, the minimum required for smooth gameplay. Even so, we still measured a huge speed difference between the previous leader, the 3090 Ti, and the new champ, the 4090, the latter leading by 64%. Upping the resolution to 4K makes Shadow of the Tomb Raider only playable with ray tracing on 30 series GPUs if you turn on DLSS. In contrast, the 4090 is so powerful that it can render the game at a smooth 87 FPS without resorting to DLSS. Of course, if you turn on DLSS, the game runs even better at an unparalleled 156 FPS, which is 68% faster than the 3090 Ti. Of all the new features and enhancements in the new GeForce 40 series, the biggest and most exciting is clearly DLSS 3. As previously noted, DLSS 2 does a great job of speeding up the frame rate in hard-to-run games, but DLSS 3 is far more ambitious, not just upscaling frames but creating all new frames on the fly, with NVIDIA claiming up to a 4 times performance improvement over native rendering. As it's a brand new feature, we could only test it on a small number of titles in time for this video, although NVIDIA has announced that more than 30 titles will be adding support imminently. In the meantime, let's see how DLSS performs using a special build of Cyberpunk 2077 and 3D Mark. We benchmarked the new 4090 against the old 3090 Ti. In Cyberpunk 2077 at 4K, turning on DLSS 3 increased the frame rate by 126%, taking it from a borderline smooth experience of 72 FPS to a silky smooth nirvana of 138 FPS. We also saw a similar speed up in 3D Mark from DLSS 3. In this title, we were also able to benchmark DLSS 2 versus the new smarter DLSS 3, seeing a significant 25% speed up. Even though we were only able to test DLSS 3 in a couple of titles, it's clearly a huge step forward, boosting performance even more dramatically than DLSS 2. What's also really important to say here is that at no point during testing did we ever notice any significant difference in image quality when DLSS 3 was enabled, unlike, say, the first iteration of DLSS, which definitely had issues. In summary, the DLSS 3 looks to be a fantastic addition to the NVIDIA toolbox, and yet another reason to consider a GeForce 40 series GPU over its competitors. We also ran the synthetic benchmark 3D Mark Timespy on all of the graphics cards. Now, you should always take these results of synthetic benchmarks with a pinch of salt compared to real games. But in this instance, the 4090's 51% lead over the next fastest GPU, the 3090 Ti, isn't too dissimilar to the 4 real games that we benchmarked earlier in this video. The Port Royal version of 3D Mark adds in ray tracing support, so has a lot more eye candy to feast your eyes on. Once again, the 4090 proved to have a massive lead over the other GPUs, this time stretching out an incredible 70% above the 3090 Ti. Now, graphics cards aren't just critical for gaming. In many situations, they're also much faster than CPUs at tasks such as 3D rendering, especially if you switch over to the NVIDIA Studio driver. V-Ray is a popular rendering application, and its standalone V5 benchmarking tool runs in 2 modes. Firstly, rasterize using just the CUDA cores, and a second test using the RT cores. And what's immediately clear here is that the 4090 is not just a gaming monster. It's also incredibly fast at rendering, with an 87% speed up over the 3090 Ti. We also ran Octane rendering benchmark on the GPUs, once again seeing the 4090 pull well ahead of the rest of the pack. With an 80% lead, the incredible rendering performance of the 4090 in Octane and V-Ray is perhaps an even bigger deal than its gaming performance, as shorter renders will free up more of your time to iterate new designs. We also ran the synthetic benchmark Geekbench 5 which runs through the variety of compute calculations in both OpenCL and CUDA mode. This shows a very similar pattern to the two rendering applications, V-Ray and Octane, with the 4090 having a massive 56% lead over the next fastest GPU, the 3090 Ti. As expected, all that performance comes at a cost, with the 4090 drawing a lot more power than the other high-end graphics cards. This shows just how important it is that you choose the right power supply and case cooling. However, there's no arguing with the performance of the 4090. It simply is a beast. The NVIDIA GeForce RTX 20 series rewrote the rules of what graphics cards could do, unleashing a whole new era of gorgeous-looking games with realistic ray tracing. The following RTX 30 series GPUs cemented this legacy with hugely improved performance and a very effective upscaling technology, DLSS 2, that enabled ray tracing at smooth frame rates even at 4K. Two innovative technologies that NVIDIA's competitors have only just started to catch up on with their own versions. Today's launch of the RTX 40 series and the debut model, the RTX 4090, sees another massive leap forward in graphics with the new features of the Ada Lovelace architecture, making games up to 70% faster and renders up to 87% faster. And that would be a big deal if that was the end of the story, but it isn't. An incredibly clever new performance-enhancing technology, DLSS 3, which combines the best of DLSS 2 upscaling with whole new AI-generated frames, something only possible thanks to Ada having such powerful tensor cores. Now, whilst DLSS 3 is still in its infancy, it shows incredible promise, boosting performance by up to 143% without any noticeable difference in image quality when gaming. At the risk of sounding trite, DLSS 3 is a game changer, and it makes the RTX 4090 an incredibly desirable graphics card. Why not let us know in the comments section below what you think of the incredible new RTX 4090 and DLSS 3. Then head over to the Scan website using the links in the description to check out the full range of RTX 4090 graphics cards and gaming PCs from 3XS Systems with NVIDIA's latest and greatest built right in.